I don't think we could have arrived where we have arrived if we hadn't started at the gold standard. It's all created the same way. There is no distinction between money printing and non-money printing. There's no reason why money spending and then issuing of bonds is less inflationary than money spending without the issuance of bonds. It's quite frustrating for me to see politicians advocating a kind of responsibility in fiscal spending, which is akin to household finances, and kind of make a parallel like Rachel Reeves did of being responsible in terms of matching, your income and borrowing to your spending, as a household would have to do, as being the responsible thing to do in government, because it's actually very, very irresponsible. So the deficits that we have been accumulating, that government debt that we have been accumulating, is not been distributed equally across the population. It's been more and increasingly pooling up on the top 1%. And that causes problems because capitalism also needs demand to function.
So, hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am delighted to be joined by Patricia Pino, co-host of the MMT Podcast, PhD candidate in inflation and economics, and founder of MMT UK. Patricia, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, not a problem. So we got in touch because I saw some tweets of yours and started listening to your podcast a little bit. And thought you might be a very interesting person to talk to in the midst of a lot of discussions that people are having about inflation, about the economy, about debt, about money, about crypto and what that might mean. There's plenty going on in the world of economics to discuss. So I guess the best place to start is one of the myths that keeps getting passed around at the moment regarding how a government budget works. There was an interview going out with Rachel Reeves and Nick Robinson during, I think it was this week, where they were talking about how, her mum used to like count up all the receipts and make sure everything lined up, and the guy who definitely knows that's not how a government's finances work sort of just nodded along and was like, yes, that's no wonder you're so fiscally responsible, Rachel. So why is that not correct, basically?
I roll my eyes whenever those comparisons are made. Obviously, she's trying to kind of allude to a sense of responsibility that people have in their households, right? And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with claiming that you're responsible and good at household finances. The issue comes, of course, when you compare those against the government's. The government, it's very different to a household in terms of finances, because in a nutshell, the government issues the currency, whereas households don't issue the currency, they use the currency. So in order for households to spend their income, spend money, they first have to get an income, either through a job or they have to borrow the funds. And if they don't do these things before they spend, then the funds are simply not available for them to use. So either obtaining an income or borrowing is a prerequisite for them to spend. The government, on the other hand, is the other way around. The government cannot collect income for itself through taxation unless it has spent money into existence first. So not only there is no prerequisite for the government to obtain an income or borrow in inverted commas, and I'll come back to that, because borrow for the government doesn't even mean the same thing that it does for a household. But there is no prerequisite to obtain funds before it can actually spend into the economy. So, because the government is, of course, the source of the currency, and if the government doesn't spend currency, then there wouldn't be any currency in the system in the first place. So, it's it's quite frustrating for me to see politicians advocating a kind of responsibility in fiscal spending, which is akin to household finances, and kind of make a parallel like Rachel Reeves did of being responsible in terms of matching, your income and borrowing to your spending, as a household would have to do, as being the responsible thing to do in government, because it's actually very, very irresponsible. It's probably the most irresponsible thing you can do in terms of fiscal spending. Unfortunately, is a parallel that resonates with people, of course, because they experience it in their lives, and they don't. They haven't really been told that things can work in a different way. So it's widely accepted. If you see our media, if you see TV shows, movies, from the moment you're born, and now I have a 1-year-old starting to see cartoons, and I see how prevailing these myths are about the government being financially constrained in the same way that a household is. Now, all that I've said is, of course, is in relation to a government that issues its own currency, such as the UK or the US, Japan, Australia, and as well as doesn't hold a significant amount of foreign denominated debt, or is not, which is to say, is not dependent on a foreign currency for its kind of day-to-day management. The UK has very little foreign denominated debt. So for those governments, they are not financially constrained in their own currency. Of course, the government doesn't issue a foreign currency, so it becomes a little bit different if a government doesn't issue its own currency, like the countries in the Eurozone or Puerto Rico, for example. And that's different. But in the case of the big economies, at least, then we can say that this is true.
Mm. What cartoons are you showing your 1-year-old that are discussing like fiscal responsibility by a government?
Well, I try to be honest. I try to minimize the screen time, and I think a lot of parents will agree with me. It's not as easy as I thought it would be to minimize screen time, but I do my best. But yeah, I think even Peppa Pig has an episode on finance. It's
Really?
very
Wow. Okay.
It's very subtle. You know what? It's little things here and there. Once you pick it up, you notice it in all the movies, in everything, basically. Sorry.
That's funny. No, so you said there that trying to treat a government's finances like a household's is like the most irresponsible thing that a chancellor could do. Like, why is that irresponsible?
Because the objectives of a household and the objectives of the government are very different. A household is trying to obtain services to goods and services in order to feed or to provide for its inhabitants, and it first has to, as I said, is financially constrained, so it has to borrow or obtain an income in order to obtain those things. And if it borrows too much, then that debt can become crippling, and then it can spiral into bankruptcy. And so the responsible thing to do is to always have as a first consideration your income and your borrowing, and then see from there what can you afford to buy, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that with the government is the other way around. The source of money is the government. So you and I would not be able to pay taxes unless money had been spent into existence first. That money has to come from somewhere before you and I can pay taxes. Of course, none of us has a money printing machine at home, unless you want to tell me something.
No,
but
I'll admit to it.
But so the government needs to first make sure that if it's going to tax people, that people can access the currency they need in order to pay that tax. So this can be quite confusing to people, because they've always understood taxation as the means by which the government raises funds. Taxation is the means by which the government acquires non-financial resources. That is all it's trying to do. The imposition of a tax is not because the government wants the currency per se. It's because they want our citizens to carry out real kind of work activities that to obtain that currency before they can pay it. So the value to the government is the work that we're doing to provide the currency, and where so we said the currency derives value from the taxation, because the government is saying you owe me, I don't know, for the sake of argument, let's say £100 a month in tax, and I'm then going to spend £200 into existence, and I'm going to pay you £200 to build a road. And then at the end of the month, you have £200, you pay the government £200 in taxation, and you may retain the remainder for yourself. That is the deficit. So the government deficit is enabling both the paying of the tax, but also is enabling the private sector to save some money for a rainy day. And so if you do the opposite, if you try to reduce the deficit, or you try to kind of forcefully reduce the debt. The debt is simply, for the sake of a definition, it's just a sum of all previously accumulated historical deficits that the government has ever had. Mm-hmm. So if the government sees that as a bad thing and says, no, we need to reduce that, then what it needs to do is run a surplus, which means that one month it might say, okay, I'm going to charge you £100 of tax at the end of the month. But this time I'm only going to spend £50 for you to, I don't know, build me half a road. So you do that, you get your £50. And of course, when it comes to paying the tax, you need to go into debt, or you need to use up savings that you've got in order to be able to pay the taxation that you owe the government. So in that case, the government has a surplus. So I think the key to understand is that whatever the government does in terms of the fiscal balance, it's a mirror image on the private sector. So if the government is running a deficit, the private sector, then what we call the non-government sector, for the sake of accuracy, has a surplus. And if the government is running a surplus, then the non-government sector has a deficit. So if a government runs surpluses causing a non-government deficit for a substantial amount of time, you can eventually lead to recession, because as I said, the non-government sector doesn't issue currency. Eventually, that private debt becomes crippling, and it's not sustainable, and you can lead to financial crisis and all sorts of things, and to recession above all. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I had a couple of questions. So, is that why? Because I think that government. I'm just trying to Google the stats to see if I can find the thing that I saw recently. But is that why? Okay, here it is. So, early 20th century, early 1900s, the government spending as a proportion of GDP was 15%, and then it sort of increases during the wars, obviously, right up to like 70%. Then it goes down to about 40% in the 60s, and then it's sort of been slowly rising again after like hitting like a base at about 35%. So the rising again, is that because is that what you're talking about, this idea that like government spending is creating more, or government deficits are creating more money in the economy, so that's why their portion of spending as a portion of GDP is increasing?
You refer, when you were talking about the figures about the war, you were talking about government debt levels.
No, so I'm talking about government spending as a portion of GDP.
Right. So,
maybe this is something you're not familiar with, but yeah. But as the debt during the war obviously was well north of 100% of GDP as well, right?
Yeah, and the reason for that was that the government was spending a lot of money in order to achieve full employment and basically have most of the population fighting, and then whatever remains to provide goods and services at home. So we were really stretched to the max back then.
Yeah. So you talk about government as the source of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have heard competing theories that suggest that commercial banks are the real source of money creation and not government. So, like, where is that coming from?
I mean, it's true. I think I use the word currency because I mean, money is a very vague term, but so government issues the currency. Commercial banks have a charter from the government, are allowed to issue money, but the money that commercial banks issue is called credit. So what that means is that when the government spends currency, that currency is a financial asset to the non-government sector. So it's an asset that doesn't have a matching debt within the non-government sector, because as we say, the debt element of that is on the government side. It gets added up to the government debt, not the non-government debt. So that is a financial asset to the non-government sector. But when commercial banks create money, credit, they create both an asset and a matching liability. So, for example, if you were going to borrow 10 grand, the bank would both credit your, whoever you were borrowing from, credit your current account with 10 grand. That is your asset. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, it would set a liability in your name for 10 grand. So you need to repay the asset. So when you add those up, they cancel out. And when you repay that debt, the money gets destroyed effectively. So credit is an important type of money in the economy because it allows flexibility in the way that we spend. It allows us to get finance when we need it urgently, but it's not sustainable as the only means of money. The currency issued by the government still underpins the whole economy and underpins your ability to repay the credit that you've borrowed. So the banks are not constrained they can issue as much credit as they want, for example. However, the decisions on whether they issue credit or not are based on your affordability, on you saying, I've got this much income coming in the next year or so. They look at your whole finances and the health of your finances and your job particularly relies on government spending, on the government issuance of currency. So credit is indirectly kind of linked or sustained by government issuance of currency. But technically, there is no technical limit to which banks can issue. And of course, that can cause problems if they're not properly regulated or they don't do proper checks, or they are incentivized in one way or another to kind of look the other way when things are not quite affordable. Then things can get out of control and then you can have a financial crisis.
Yeah, so that's basically what happened in 2008, right?
Yes. Okay. So it's funny, 2008, I mean, everybody agrees that the banks, there was a lot of fraud going around, there was a lot of the wrong incentives going around and a lot of conflicting interests within the system. One thing that I think is less appreciated is that had we not have that kind of period of boom, completely credit-driven period of boom, we would have probably had a recession, or we would have, had an era of really small growth or non-existent growth. So kind of the booming 90s were probably a result of that credit issuance. So, and of course, nobody's saying, okay, well, what would have been the alternative if it wasn't credit? And I think to some extent, the people who liberalized credit issuance kind of knew this. It's difficult for me to think that they wouldn't not have been aware that cutting back on government spending and starting the whole neoliberal period, which brought about some austerity, you couldn't mask that in some way by liberalizing credit and make it easier for people to borrow, and therefore kind of create this false kind of sense of well-being in the economy that, of course, it came to a crash in 2008.
So you said you would come back to borrowing when we talk about the government borrowing money, and this is something that sort of confuses me, despite the number of times people have explained this to me. Like we're a sovereign nation with the ability to issue our own currency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we paying interest on the debt? Like, it's really like, because that's it's I don't know what it's like hitting all-time highs, like the service in the debt. But if it's just our money, like, why are we paying interest?
So I believe we're kind of on a path-dependent history, right? So I don't think we could have arrived where we have arrived if we hadn't started at the gold standard, for example. In the gold standard, you had a set amount of gold, and then you had to make sure that the government, when it issues currency, it can have that arrives in the system as something called reserves. Okay, for the sake of this explanation, but you had to make sure that your reserves could at any time be exchanged for a fixed quantity of gold in storage. So to do that, you needed to control the amount of reserves you had in the system. So the only way to control the amount of reserves to have for the system would be, if you're spending money and creating more reserves, would be to drain those reserves into another type of money that then we call bonds. And those bonds are not convertible into gold. So that way, when the government issued bonds, it was kind of borrowing in order to be able to spend more reserves into the economy. We're not in the gold standard anymore because it was very limiting. It caused a lot of problems. But right now, following that period, the bonds then kind of had a different type of a different objective, and that was to achieve a set overnight interest rate by the Bank of England. The Bank of England, at the moment, they have a mandate to control inflation, and they believe that they can control inflation through interest rates. So they have this one lever that they can use, and the way that they use it is they used it because until recently, until QE, that changed a little bit. But up until QE, the way they would do it is they would cause a shortage of reserves between the banks. The reserves sit on the commercial banks' accounts at the government. They would cause a shortage of those reserves, and then issue bonds at a set interest rate. And that shortage of reserves caused the banks to have to sort of lend to each other reserves for their daily operations. And when they lent each other reserves, then they would use an interest rate that was in relation to the interest rate that the government was paying on those bonds. Mm-hmm. So the bonds then become a tool for controlling the overnight rate. And that was the main way, that is still the main way in which the government controls inflation. I would argue it's not very effective. And since QE, there's even less of a reason to issue it. But the reason I was saying borrowing is problematic is not the same. It's because what the government is doing is not like it's not taking money and then taking that money and using it somewhere else. Mm-hmm. That money still sits where it is. It simply changes the nature of that money. It's like saying, okay, reserves are blue money, bonds are yellow money. I'm going to change your blue money for yellow money, and the yellow money pays interest, so I'll give you that. It's a government liability in the sense that the government is promising to pay interest on it, mm-hmm. but it's not borrowing in the same way that you and I would do it.
Mm. Okay, so I guess I'm still Like, I get, yeah, sorry. I don't, can't we just print it and give it to ourselves? And not like, why do we have to involve the Bank of England in this? Like, what, or well, why do we have to involve like the banks? Like, why can't we just print the money and use it without
Well,
without the yeah? I mean,
that's a very good point. Well, to do that, I mean, printing money, it's again a term I think that came from the gold standard, and that kind of it made a distinction between what was money that was sort of seen to dilute the value of the reserves against the gold, and that was kind of seen as kind of illegitimate money almost. So that was then called printing money. But now all money is created in the same way, as you say. Every time the government spends, money is created. The Treasury gives an instruction to the Bank of England to mark up the accounts at the commercial banks that hold the accounts of either the government departments or the individuals that the government is paying, and that's it. And there's nothing once the Treasury, or better said, once the Parliament has approved payment going out, there is nothing in the system that can stop it. There's no kind of pool of money that people are checking that has been credited before money can go out. No. The consolidated fund, which is the main account that the government has, and by the way, the system is incredibly complicated, but it kind of comes down to the consolidated fund. It goes negative on a daily basis from all the payments the government does. It is policy to have it go back to zero at the end of the day and to transfer whatever negative figure there is on there to another account. That's just the way that the government manages its accounts. But that doesn't mean that it's financially constrained. It's just accounting. It's just moving numbers from one side to the other. As you say, there's no reason to issue bonds. There's a strong belief that if you don't issue bonds, that amounts to printing money, and therefore is illegitimate money, and therefore we're all gonna drown in inflation. No, I think that comes from a misunderstanding of what inflation is caused by, and actually, if you issue bonds like we are now, I think last year we paid about £82 billion in interest on the bonds.
Imagine hospitals we could build.
And remember, we're issuing bonds because presumably that's our way of addressing inflation. And the higher interest rates are supposed to lower inflation. And yet higher interest rates means that we're paying more money on bonds, which means that we have to create more money to pay for these interest rates. So it sounds counterproductive to me. That's one of the reasons that it sounds counterproductive. The other reason is that it's not progressive at all. You're giving money to people that already have funds and have assets in the forms of government bonds. So it's conducive to inequality. And the whole premise of using interest rates to control inflation is also quite inhumane in my view, because you're talking about their thinking is that if they raise interest rates, are going to lower investment, that lowering of investment is going to lower employment, that the rise in unemployment is going to cause workers to think twice before negotiating higher wages. And therefore, people are not going to have the higher wages to cause the demand in the system that is going to then lead to higher prices. So when they say we're going to help workers by lowering inflation, by increasing interest rates and causing unemployment, make you poorer in order to lower prices, and that's as you're supposed to think as for that, it doesn't really make any sense to me, or it seems a very bad way to do it. So the only policy lever that we have is to punish workers whenever there is high inflation. And, if that's the only tool you have for decades and decades and decades, and of course you're going to see, more and more inequality build up as interest rates benefit the rich, and workers are always being punished whenever there's an issue with inflation.
Yeah, because I don't know. Cause I think this brings us beautifully onto what actually causes inflation. So my understanding is essentially, and this is my schooling, perhaps it's not quite accurate, but that a massive expansion of the money supply can cause inflation because it feels like you used the word earlier, you're diluting the value of the monetary token. And also the cost of energy. That seems to be a massive driver for me of inflation, because the cost of electric and fuel basically goes up. You can see it in the UK during I think it was the start of the Ukraine war. Like gas prices went through the roof. Oil prices were also quite high. And then all the electricity companies put the prices up. The fact that the price of gas has now fallen again doesn't seem to have encouraged them to put the prices back down. That's probably another question, but yeah, it feels to me like the expansion of the money supply and the cost of energy are the two things driving inflation. Like, what is your thought?
Right. So you've described sort of the first part that you've described is what we might call demand pull inflation. And the second part related to energy costs is what we might call cost push inflation. So the first one, that's money supply causes inflation. It kind of comes from the monetarists, and particularly from an equation, which is MV equals PQ, which is basically money times the velocity of money equals prices times output. They the assumption in order for money to increase P is that both V and Q, so the velocity of money and output, are constant, which indirectly means that you're assuming full employment. You're assuming that your capacity, you cannot possibly produce more goods if there is, if there's more purchasing power in the economy. You cannot possibly produce more goods to satisfy the purchasing power. I think in terms of what causes inflation, the first thing to understand is that all spending has the potential to cause inflation. So be that spending, be it from the government or from the private sector. And remember, the M in that equation, the term money, is very, very vague. That's one of the problems the monetarists had in the 80s with that equation, is that they didn't know what M should include. There's many definitions of M. You can, if you're talking about all bank deposits, for example, you're including all the credit within the economy. And credit can create demand if again, banks are not constrained in issuing credit. So there is a point where if they issue a lot of credit, like they did in the run up to 2008, I guess, you can create demand in order to push prices up of certain things, like housing was the example back then. So yes, if you have a lot of money going into just put it simply, into a few goods, you can cause that price to go up. So the question there is, are there too few goods? Do we have capacity to absorb the new spending into the economy? So it's not just a matter of, again, what I said earlier about government spending, it's all created the same way. There's no distinction between money printing and non-money printing. There's no reason why money spending and then issuing of bonds is less inflationary than money spending without the issuance of bonds. Mm-hmm. It's still causing the same demand, assuming the spending is of the same quantity. So it carries the same risk. The bonds don't make the spending any less inflationary. And as we discussed, it might actually make it more inflationary if you're accounting for interest payments on those bonds. So the question is, are there enough goods and services in the economy to be purchased with that money? And so you might ask yourself, if the government is, for example, trying to hire more nurses for the NHS, are the nurses available to be hired by the government? And if those resources are available to be hired, then why should prices increase? So That's the first part of your statement. And then the second one on the cost push inflation, that is, I largely agree with what you said. There are some prices that are more critical in the economy than other prices. Recently, we saw how important energy was to generating inflation, how sensitive the whole system of prices in the economy was just to that one price going up. And it does mean that, and that's because all industries are interrelated, right? All industries have input from each other, and energy is found in every single industry. There are other things that are found in that are quite crucial. Some basic materials may be quite important as well, but energy being probably the most important. Second only to labor, probably. But so in our case, interest rates are not really going to address that issue that caused the energy prices going up, because it was about international politics. It was about a war. Actually, politics is the reason behind much of the inflation, and it would have been resolved by politics. It reminds me a bit of the 1970s, the oil crisis back then, which was caused by the OPEC raising prices, and of course it's a political event. They wanted to bring problems for the West, so that's what they did. They raised prices and they caused a huge bout of inflation. And of course, we could do nothing about it because we do not control the price of those goods. So the way to have gone about it is to, every time that we import a good into the economy that is as essential for the whole system of prices, then we are putting ourselves at the mercy of fluctuations of that price. Especially, if they're outside the country, then there is very limited things. There's very few things we can do to actually influence that. And even the response of, okay, well, we need to generate more power at home. That's the right attitude, but it would have come in handy 10 years earlier, and to prevent that, because building power stations takes a while. And you might not see the benefits, but it's still a good idea to build resilience to prevent a future events such as that. But that's entirely cost push inflation.
Is inflation inevitable? Like, is one of the I talk to a lot of Bitcoiners, and they seem to think that it doesn't have to be like this. Basically, like that's the to put it very, very briefly, it's like, is it? Do we have to have inflation? Is that necessary?
I mean, inflation, there's not just one entity that sets prices in the economy. Okay, the government can influence prices a lot because the government purchases a lot of things, so it can say what price it's willing to purchase, and very often the private sector, it cannot just simply say no. But the private sector, and depending as well on how your economy is structured. So, for example, if you have a lot of private providers of energy in your economy, then they may have some power as well to over setting their prices. And depending on how many monopolies there are, that gives them more power to set their prices. So inflation is a function of the power imbalances within your economy. And the inflation figure that we use, which is CPI in the UK, it's we don't simply take the average of all prices. We take a basket of goods, and I think this kind of basket is adjusted every year depending on changing purchasing habits. And then we estimate what a figure that might be representative of what the average consumer is experiencing. But of course, you can have very many figures for inflation. And depending on whether you are wealthy or poor, your basket of goods may look completely different. So we are very limited in our measuring of inflation in the first place. But what is true is that because it encompasses so many small prices, and for there not to be any inflation at all, what you're saying is that no price would ever change. I think unless you had one single provider for all these services fixing prices, then it would be very difficult for it not to change at all. But it can be kept low as long as you identify the key industries like energy. You make sure that those are under control. You make sure that you tie your government spending, that it's done in relation to what goods and services are available to purchase. That means both eliminating unemployment, but also making sure that once you're not outbidding yourself. So you're not just creating a situation where you can have one party bidding more and more and more for one good that is in shortage. But big hyperinflationary episodes, those kind of things, tend to happen when there is a supply shock. So system is equilibrium, and then suddenly there's a war or something happens, or a weather event that a crop fails, or a war wipes out kind of food production or key industry, and then suddenly production collapses, and then suddenly you've got all that money going into fewer and fewer goods. That's usually what triggers hyperinflation, right? Yeah. It's not usually the other way around. But yeah, it's very difficult, but it's possible to have a relatively stable inflation. Now, the notion that inflation is inherently bad, inflation is also always benefiting somebody. So within the equation of prices, if you're talking about cost push inflation, the cost of wages is also something that goes into production and into the creation of prices. So if suddenly workers' wages are going up, and inflation increases slightly as a result of that, as long as the wages are going up more than the inflation is, then the workers are actually benefiting from that. So it's wrong to see inflation as always a bad thing. Inflation, of course, is bad if you're not the one who's benefiting from it. But I get the feeling that sometimes crypto people, I'm sure they come from all sorts of life. But a lot of the time it infers that that money that they have in the bank should always it's almost like a belief that if you have, say, X pounds in the bank and you leave them there for, I don't know, for decades, then that money should be worth the same tomorrow as it's worth, in 3 decades as it's worth today. It's almost like a matter of principle to them that should be the case. Am I wrong to say that?
I guess so. I think one of the arguments that they also make is that capitalism, or at least like progress within an economy, is meant to bring the price of things down. So, okay, whilst perhaps the value of money might slowly decrease over time, that the purchasing power should remain the same because goods should become cheaper as technology advances, essentially. So I think that their point is that it may not have like the exact same like value, but like its purchasing power should remain the same. I think that's more the point.
So we're really talking about income here, because if the GDP is going up, then everybody should have an equal share of that increase in GDP, right?
Yeah, in an ideal world, but yeah.
Yeah, the issue is that for the last three or 4 decades now, wages have remained stagnant, if not falling a bit.
Yeah, especially since 2008.
Yeah, well, GDP keeps going up. How? Private debt. So
growing population as well, I think, makes it look like we're growing the economy when we're not. I think.
Yeah, maybe. But so I think they really have a beef with the same things that I have a beef about, but their approach to solving them are completely different.
Yeah.
So I don't have an issue with the money. I think the money is being because I see democracy allowing money being a way in which we can organize society to collective benefit.
Mm.
As I said, we can use the power of taxation and to direct resources to things that will benefit us all, like roads and houses and all these things. But the problem is that that deficit, so the deficits that we have been accumulating, that government debt that we have been accumulating, it's not been distributed equally across the population. It's been more and increasingly pooling up on the top 1%. And that causes problems because capitalism also needs demand to function, right? And the way that demand is being replaced is by private debt, but that's not a sustainable long-term strategy. And I think that we've come to the end. I thought we came to the end in 2008. I think I'm surprised that 17 years on now, we're still kind of not out of this issue of how do we have prosperity if we are relying entirely on credit, and and at what point we accept that the government has to have an active role in making sure that there's full employment but that people have decent incomes, but also that there is no inequality that can cause those political issues.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I wanted to ask about was the CPI, actually, because if we look here, I found an article from the BBC just showing inflation from 2016 through to December 2024. So 2016 is bit like I'm not sure how accurate this is, but it says inflation was almost at 0%. Maybe that's accurate. I actually don't know. Then 2018 sort of goes up to about 3%, and then sort of slowly comes back down right to the start of the pandemic, where it's basically at 0% again. Then it spikes up to like 11% sort of slowly through to like mid 2022, and then down sort of end of 2024 we're at 2.5% again. To me, that doesn't feel accurate. Like that just doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like that's the real story of how horrendous the
you think it's more substantial than that?
I mean, I don't know. It's just that's the sense I get. Like, I don't feel like it was only 10%. Like, and I know a lot of people sort of believe that the CPI is a government manipulated figure that they sort of choose that what they're going to say the CPI is, or at least they're going to choose the weighting of certain things within their calculation to say this works out better. Like, I don't know, maybe just because I live in London as well, rent for me from 2020 to 2024 went up like 30-40%. Like that. So, and then, it felt like groceries doubled in some senses. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't feel like the CPI in the way it's calculated is an accurate reflection of like what inflation is for day-to-day life.
Yeah, and that's because we have one single figure telling us what everybody's experiencing. Yeah. And of course, not all prices go up by the same percentage. All prices can change substantially. I think the cost of energy went up, was that 20% or something like that? And that may have carried over to some goods, not other goods. But the issue is that your basket of goods may look completely different to the basket of goods that they're using to calculate this figure. And it might look completely different to my basket of goods. So the inflation that you're experiencing on your day-to-day basis may be completely different to what somebody else may. And that's largely dependent. I mean, it depends on many things, but one of the key things it depends on is your class. If you're on a low income, you will have a certain goods that you go for because they're cheap, and then maybe that's 20 pence a bag of rice that you're buying or something, and suddenly that's going up twofold or threefold. It may not seem like a lot, but to that person, it is. And so, yeah, I think we need more measures of inflation. We need to know. We don't have a really good view as to what is happening on the class front. Who is benefiting, who is not benefiting from this inflation. As I said, somebody's always benefiting from inflation. So whose income is going up, whose income is not going up, and whose prices are going up and whose prices are not going down. I don't know why they don't do that. I don't think the Bank of England are very good friends with the government, but maybe they are. I think they don't find it useful. I guess maybe because they have one single lever, right? They have the one single interest rate. They don't even have a collection of interest rates, just the one interest rate that they've got to use to sort out all the inflation. So if suddenly they had 3 different figures of inflation that were saying different things, how would you go about addressing it?
Oh, yeah, you'd see scenes like that SpongeBob scene inside his brain where everyone's like tearing files out of filing cabinets and everything's on fire. I think was probably happening.
Yeah.
So unfortunately we are rapidly approaching time when I have to go, but I wanted to ask one question because we've not got to very many of the things I actually want to ask about. But what do you think of the Bitcoin strategic reserve idea that is being floated at the minute?
I'll keep a close eye on it because first of all, it surprised me that the Bitcoiners were celebrating this, given that I thought the whole thing was about, getting rid of government and doing something independently of government. And suddenly they're celebrating that the government's getting involved in it. And I think they're celebrating because, of course, they just bagged the biggest purchaser of assets in the whole economy. And as I said, they've got unlimited money to buy as many Bitcoin as they want.
Well, they can only they can only get so many. There are only so many exist.
They've announced a limited amount, but in theory, they could increase that.
That would be incredibly difficult. You'd have to get 50. You'd have to get more than 50% of the owners of all of the nodes to agree in order.
Oh, you mean issuing the Bitcoin? No, yeah. I mean the government has announced that it's going to buy a certain amount of.
Yeah,
I think 1 billion.
No, they have a certain amount on their balance sheet that has been confiscated as part of like investigations, and what they want to start with is then putting that on the books basically. But there's 11 states have now passed or at least introduced.
But then they were going to purchase some more.
11. Well, yeah, that's remains to be seen. I don't think they'll if that's their plan, they wouldn't say it because that would mean that some other governments would try and front run them. So we won't know if that's actually going to happen until it's already happened. Because if the US government announces that they're going to buy some Bitcoin as a strategic for whatever reason they see fit to announce, China will immediately do the same. Russia will probably do you know what I mean? Governments will try to front run them some slightly slower and more analog version of an HFT. Like they're going to try and front run the trade. So I think they wouldn't announce it until they actually do it.
Yeah. Well, I think there's only 3 reasons to get involved with Bitcoin. I think either you are super ideologically wedded to the project, which, fair play to you, or you are speculating that it's going to go up in price, or you're a criminal. So these 3, as far as I know, there is no practical use of Bitcoin outside of.
Oh, I mean, there's a lot of cases that. One case I've heard is that if people then decide to use it as like an international basis for payments, that it would mean that you could use excess energy generated by, say, like hydropower stations or wind power stations or solar farms, so that when it wasn't being used, it would be a way to generate income from them in order to make them more profitable as an enterprise, to actually bring down the cost of electric. So that's all very theoretical. That's just what people have told me.
I see these promises. It could be, and I understand the technology. For example, I think there was a digital currency that the Bank of England was proposing, and I think it was
Bitcoin.
It was to do the kind of, I think what you're saying, to facilitate transactions and it could be something as simple as everybody having a bank account in the Bank of England, and bypassing all the commercial banks. But I find it difficult to believe, because Bitcoin behaves and is very much just an asset. A financial asset that has no real value is at the moment is driven primarily through speculation, through its limited use through criminal activities, and as well as through the ideological project. So the price fluctuates too much at the moment. It goes through huge spikes and then some collapses, huge spikes, and if that was a currency, if that was the UK pound doing that, you wouldn't be happy.
No.
If that was the UK CPI, I mean, you saw that 10% spike in CPI, and that was to you, that was felt so substantially. Yeah. Imagine the 100% CPI increase or collapse or deflation of 20% that Bitcoin goes through on a regular basis, and it suddenly becomes too risky. If something is really volatile like that, then it's of limited use for the purposes that you mentioned, because for people to hold Bitcoin is inherently an incredibly risky thing to hold, because tomorrow the price may collapse 20% and you have to deal with that loss. So that's why I wouldn't advocate, governments, by particularly developing economies, getting their hands into Bitcoin. But so yeah, I see it as little more at the moment, the project, as little more than just profit grabbing. It's gonna benefit people who have big holdings of Bitcoin. And this is me speculating, by the way, I'm not an expert, but I think it's gonna benefit big holders of Bitcoin who have been looking for ways of maybe profiting from
trade. Yeah. That's one of the fears people have, that they're pushing the US government to provide exit liquidity for their trade.
Exactly. And that just shows that what they really value is not Bitcoin as a currency. They're valuing the dollar as a currency. Yeah. And they're using Bitcoin to get their hands on the dollar, on more dollars. So that just shows you right there that not even many Bitcoiners believe Bitcoin to be a currency. But there you go.
Well, they have to crack the L2 problem yet. And no one has. Lightning seemed to not quite work the way that people wanted it to. So we'll see. Anyway, unfortunately, I have to really run. But thank you very much for your time. I will put the links for the MMT podcast and your Twitter and stuff in the description below. And people check it out. Great podcast, very interesting. Some great guests. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out. And you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.